Welcome back from our first and hopefully very productive breakout session. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, who is Professor Bonnie Stewart from the University of Windsor. Her Twitter handle is @BonStewart, BonStewart. She is an educator and social media researcher interested in the implications of digital networks for institutions, for society, and for learning. Assistant Professor of Online Pedagogy and Workplace Learning, Bonnie has an extensive background in digital and experiential education and in adult learning approaches. Founder and director of Antigonish 2.0 and current visiting fellow at the University of Arts, London in the UK, Bonnie was an early MOOC researcher and ethnographer of Twitter as an academic environment. Her current research interests include what it means to know, to learn, and to be a citizen in our current information ecosystem. Bonnie.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Great. I think you can hear me. This feels kind of loud, but it's good? It's all right? Okay. I just want to say it is a huge honor and privilege to be here, to be back in the Maritimes, back on the territory of Mi'kmaq, and back bringing the idea of Antigonish 2, which Wendy and I started up and worked hard on, kind of back home to see what the next steps might be. I want to talk today, and I will talk, but a story about systems. Okay, this is really about systems, and basically, we need to have a talk about the web. It is the cutest little dumpster fire out there, but nonetheless, it is a dumpster fire. Now, how many of you in the room, how many of you use the web? Okay, so it's our dumpster fire. How many of you use it in some way for your work? Okay, research, publication, teaching. What about just like socializing? Connecting with scholars elsewhere? Okay, great. Fun fact, the internet used to be really great for all those things. Now we do get to watch late-stage capitalism in some of its poorer incarnations, but I want to go back a little bit to kind of the peak era of Web 2.0. And this idea of participatory communications, participatory connection, is for me still at the core of everything that I do, whether it's online or not. The idea of Web 2.0, how many of you remember the term? It was a big deal because instead of just being the web where we took books and put them online, or we took the Encyclopedia Britannica and put it online, it meant that we had a read-write web that you and I could make the things that were out there. And the users were producing the things that were used. And I was on that web in a big way, not as a scholar early on, but actually as a blogger, as a mommy blogger, because I spent literally months in the IWK hospital while I was based on PEI waiting to have a child, and I was bored out of my skull. And my partner was a webcaster, a podcaster, I guess we would call it now, and he's like, why don't you get a blog or something? Because I wanted to send people updates, but I didn't want to spam people's inbox with, it's day 17 in this bed, and so I started a blog. And what happened was I didn't start because I was reading mommy blogs or because I knew that there was a participatory community out there, but they found me. And what happened over 6 years of that blog, which I eventually closed because I was kind of done with the story and my kids were getting older, etc., I ended up with literally 13,000, I went back and counted these a couple of weeks ago, 530 comments. These weren't spam. These were actually comments from other people or links to their blogs. From an academic citation perspective, that's really good engagement, right? That was how I got into the participatory web. And in about 2010, in the middle of this period, I went back UPEI, I was living in PEI, had opened a PhD program in education. I thought, well, I'd been working in digital, I was interested in those things, and I thought I would like to go back and I would like to study this participatory space and its opportunities for learning. But the part that I didn't factor in at that time, in 2010, 2011, even 2012, was the ways in which the web was starting to shift pretty dramatically. I had seen it in the blogging world, where you saw monetization start to creep in about 2008, 2011, in that window. And you could see people who had been writing perfectly nice personal kind of stories suddenly throwing in and we had craft dinner for lunch, and it was absolutely delicious. And you started to realize that there was a hustle behind much of what people were doing, because they had found ways to essentially turn what they were contributing to the web into a brand. So I saw monetization rise, and I was curious, what will that mean for education? It's harder to hustle a product, unless it's perhaps a Pearson product or something, in an education type of post or communication or contribution, but I wanted to know about that. I also started to see algorithmic systems rise. Does anybody here remember Clout? So what Clout was I think it has gone to the great graveyard of dead apps, but it was a platform that initially took every single Twitter account, starting in about 2009, 2010, and it would quantify your reach and influence. So it was one of the early sort of, we are going to tell you how important you are on the web. Because when you have a participatory system, what you have in that attention economy, right, is I'm not sure how much this matters versus this matters. And what they were doing was saying, oh, well, you're a 62. Justin Bieber was 100%. So he was essentially their peak idea of engagement and popularity, which I always thought was kind of problematic. But what I found really interesting about Clout was they started to do a recommender system. And so they would tell you what you were good at, and kind of like LinkedIn used to do. Did any of you ever get recommendations on LinkedIn? It worked like that. And for me, it had academics, expert, adult education, expert, and being a dad, expert. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, I'm all for sort of my own slightly queer identity, but at the same time, I actually identify as a mom, and I've never written about being a dad. So this algorithm just isn't quite getting it right. And then we started to see the misinformation show up. I actually clipped this off of Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, dead at 32. He's not dead. We started to see the sensationalism rise in the web. Again, when you have an attention economy, suddenly it isn't the fact that you've been gate-kept on the front end that keeps you from getting visibility. It's whether or not you can draw eyeballs to what you have to say. And so people go further and further out on the scale of, hey, look at me. And surveillance. How many of you have a Roomba? Anybody? Apparently, it's possible that your Roomba may also be contributing to your data footprint. Just in case you knew, this person suggests that you toss it into the sea. I'd say that's probably, we have enough plastics in the ocean, but possibly we have now the smart home, the smart car, the smart this, the smart that, and these are all systems that, frankly, we do not understand super well. What's happened with this is we've also seen increased polarization in society and radicalization, right? How many of you teach in this room? How many of you have talked with your students about where they spend time online? Yeah. And there are places like 4chan and 8chan and others online where, particularly for young, often males, often white males, if they are feeling a little bit kind of like, just don't really kind of get things, they can, it's called red-pilled, kind of get their whole worldview turned upside down in an online space that then connects them, and YouTube will do it as well, the recommender algorithm will connect them to increasingly extremist points of view, to the point where the idea that sort of the world that higher education has generally stood for, right, which is the idea of a public good, that it's good to have an engaged citizenry, etc., is mostly kind of a liberal lie, and that they need to protect their rights and positions, and that is how a lot of people in white nationalist and white supremacist movements, as well as men's rights movements, are becoming radicalized. Sophia Noble is one of the scholars who does really great work on this. And what she talks about is basically what we have done is we have taken the institutional structures behind society, and we've instead turned the power of those over to tools and systems that are technical that we do not really understand. So I went in thinking I was going to look at participatory learning, and I ended up studying the world of the 7 deadly sins. We've got Tinder for lust, Yelp for gluttony, LinkedIn for greed, Netflix for sloth, that's my own terrible sin, Twitter for wrath, Facebook for envy, and Instagram for pride. And what happens is that participation and the idea of the participatory has become increasingly pushed out of the picture of what the web is. In 2016, right after the American election, thanks to Brian Alexander, who is a futurist in the higher education space, he was running an open and public book club on this book, Miles Horton and Paulo Freire, We Make the Road by Walking. Has anybody ever read this book? It's an old one. I studied it in the 90s at the Mount in Halifax in my MEd, but it is from, I believe, the 70s, as you can probably tell by the cover. And it is a conversation between Miles Horton and Paulo Freire. And Miles Horton was one of the founders of the Highlander Center in Tennessee, which was an adult education and civil rights leader in American participatory higher ed and civil rights. And Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator. And I started by reflecting on that book and where we had gotten to with this kind of populist, increasingly polarized web. And I ended up, because a lot of the people who were reading my academic blog, which replaced the personal blog, were American or British or from other parts of the world. And I said, have any of you ever heard of the maritime adult education movement, the Antigonish Movement, right? Which I'm assuming most people in this room are familiar with. And if you're not, I had a light bulb at that time, and I thought, hey, what if we could take the principles of the adult education movement, the Antigonish movement, and apply them to the web? Now, people in this room will be able to give a way better history of the Antigonish movement than I can. But what you have is the idea of a disenfranchised population, right? And sort of a 3-part or 3-step movement to creating literacy, but also engagement and enfranchisement and control over people's own destiny, control over people's own sense of where they're going. And core to this idea of the Antigonish movement, from my perspective, was the if we can get together and identify the systems that are in place that are keeping us down, right? Because again, if you look at the maritime provinces as a whole, particularly in the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, a lot of people by that point had left. Once we had Confederation, all of the Maritimes became a little bit extraneous to central Canada. And so jobs prospects were limited. A lot of the people who stayed were less literate, etc. We became essentially more of a flyover state. And for those of us who grew up in the Maritimes, that lack of prospects has been something, it's been a theme for 150 years now. And the core of this was, if we figure out those systems that keep us down, and we get together and we put our elbow into those things together, then maybe we can make a change. But we need to learn, we need study groups, we need ways to have mass meetings and get together and figure out core priorities. We need to do this as a whole. And so, thanks to that person right there, who I wrote this post, and then a whole bunch of people were like, this is a great idea. And I had literally met Wendy at a conference a few weeks before, and I called her up and I'm like, does this seem like a ridiculous idea to you? Could we try to do this? To call it Antigonish 2.0 and see if we can maybe make something happen, particularly in the area of media literacy. Because at that point, I was realizing most of my very educated colleagues, most of the people that I knew around me, you know, at all levels of life. My sister is a hairdresser, my brother is a janitor, my colleagues were senior tenured professors, and not one of them knew what to do with the information ecosystem and the impacts on democracy that we were seeing. And so we said, what if we tried to create a system with similar three parts, but the network part, the mass meetings part, would be web-based, where we could bring people together to learn about media literacy issues, right? And what we did, whoa, okay, I won't turn that way. I won't turn my head that way. What we did, I had an article go out in Educause. I put some calls out on Twitter. I actually was able to pull together a number of people from all over this. Sherry Spellich here is an American educator who lives in Germany. She contributed to Forward Stories daily event about kind of community that we ran under the Antigonish 2 hashtag, just trying to raise awareness of this possibility and get people interested. We had a sign-up. We had a sort of mailing list that we put together. About 250 people from all over the world signed up and said, hey, I'd be interested in this. And we actually talked about trying to hold an event. I ran with the folks at Davidson College in North Carolina a MOOC, a massive open online course on engagement in a time of polarization, where we talked about the original Antigonish movement, and we talked about the Highlander Center and those histories, and then worked on how do we build participation and participatory change now. But I was precarious, sessional, adjunct faculty at a small institution without a lot of extra funds. You were staff, term, at a small institution without a lot of extra funds, and we wrote grants and that type of thing, but ultimately we could not leverage the systems we were in to go beyond the network pieces that were very successful and gained interest. We couldn't necessarily get things started, particularly where I was. And then I got the classic story of maritime outmigration, a tenure track offer in Ontario, and I moved away. And so, if the medium is the message, thank you, McLuhan, I as the medium and Wendy as the medium for starting this kind of shift could get it going network-wise, but we're not necessarily able to get it where we wanted to get it institutionally, again, particularly where I was housed. However, folks like Mike Caulfield, just one example, Holden, at Holden on Twitter, have been able to take this type of work, this media literacy piece, to really, really good places, and there are many other examples, but he runs the American Democracy Project's Digital Polarization Initiative, and If you're interested, faculty and staff can sign up and get students involved. He's put out a fact-checking, open, free textbook if you want to use something like that with students. And he runs a blog called 4 Moves, which I've used with my own students. And the blog little title is there just for one post, where he puts up potentially specious stories from the internet, and then you can have students try to figure out if they are accurate or not. So there are lots of people doing really great work in this field to keep the media literacy end of things alive. And what I moved towards was more doing digital pedagogy, digital scholarship. I've worked with the Digital Pedagogy Lab folks for years. I'm running a digital scholarship track in Fredericksburg this summer if anybody wants to come. Love to have you, but it's really about figuring out, again, the problems of scholarly communication within the systems that make up scholarship now. And that's my work, and I do things like teaching technology integration to pre-service teachers, and I get them doing hands-on stuff like responding to essays in infographics or with Twitter essays, or going through something like eCampus Ontario's open technologist module and figuring out how to work with these tools. And it's awesome, and I love it. It's great work. However, every time that I am teaching them to use these tools, I'm aware that all of those issues of data and oppression and challenges are still there. And these technocratic systems that now make up the web, because how many of you have your own domain? Okay? That's probably still less than half. And when I talk to my students about how many have their own domain, the answer is an extremely low number. And when you don't have your own domain, then you are always subject to these systems. And if you want to drive people to your domain, you're probably subject to them anyway. So this is where I'm at. I'm recognizing that I love doing the digital pedagogy work, but Twitter is not really listening to its participatory constituency at this point. Zainab Tufekski's work on we're building a dystopia to make people click on ads. Highly recommend. This is her TED Talk. But it's really about extraction capitalism and how we can drive people to the web and to sites so that their data can be collected and they can be sold things, right? Data is money at this point. And increasingly, we have sort of a system of enclosure where, what's the LMS here at StFX? Moodle, okay, and Moodle is actually an open, I'm on Blackboard now for the first time at Windsor. And these systems, the Pearson systems that will sell us, here is the whole set of textbooks. The Nelson system that is trying to sell the PEI, Department of Education, an entire K-12 system with testing included, are enclosed systems that not only have data elements to them, right? What happens to all of the students' data in those systems, but they are fixes. They are, here's a problem. It's education. We're going to sell you something to fix it. This came out yesterday. This is an article from TechRepublic on the 10 technologies that will impact higher ed the most this year. This is Robin DeRosa's tweet, 1 to 9, make me want to crawl into a hole, and then dig another hole deeper down in the hole and crawl into the second hole. These are the top 10. Next-gen security and risk management, AI, conversation interface, smart campus, predictive analytics, nudge tech, digital credentialing tech, hybrid integration platforms, career software, cross-life cycle, CRM, and finally, the only one that didn't bother her, wireless presentation technologies. This is now the field that I work in. Right? This is the enclosure of a system that started out built on the web, right? The user creates what people see, and has become systematized to an extreme extent. Biggest impact, wireless presentation, only ones that don't have serious data implications. Part of the root of the Antigonish movement was the idea that many people lived in a company store world in coal towns in the Maritimes, right? Where you worked for the company and the only place where you could buy things was through your chit at the company store. And when you are stuck in that kind of system, it's very difficult to get out because you can't reach outside the system. You can't get capital outside the system. And increasingly what's happening is that our data and AI systems, some of which are really interesting, are still being created and sold as the new company store. And this is a problem that all of us in education, if we use the web at all, at least need to be aware of. This is in China, but there is, very well recognized academics in Canada also beginning to work on facial recognition and online learning. And if you twitch, does that mean that you are thinking this? And how should we make the system responsive so that you learn more? And the real question is, what do these data systems serve? Right? Increasingly, the most wealthy students are the ones least likely to be enclosed by these systems. Increasingly, these systems have significant racial disparity and impacts. When you look at facial recognition technology and how it works on the faces of people of color, not very well. There was a scholar on Twitter just yesterday who posted her efforts to apply for a passport. She's a black woman. 4 times she put up a photo. 4 times. We can't see your eyes. We can't see the shape of your head. We can't see, and she shared all of these pieces. But these systems, these data systems are not created equally. Any of you seen any of the exciting Peppa Pig algorithmically generated? Peppa Pig is huge. How many of you have little kids? Peppa Pig is huge, right? If your kid is watching Peppa Pig on YouTube, the YouTube recommender, I think YouTube has gotten this a little bit in check in the last year, but was putting out and allowing and sending kids to versions of Peppa Pig where Peppa Pig drinks bleach, where Peppa Pig turns into bacon, where Peppa Pig does things that no 5-year-old needs to see. So this doesn't just affect those of us in higher ed. It affects elections, right? They just found out that the bots element of this, bots can be really fun. How many of you have ever followed any bot accounts? It's neat to see what random generation of communications can do. But bot accounts are filling our democratic spaces. And so in any contested election, if you see a whole bunch of people outstanding for a particular candidate, check. A lot of them will have actually the same start date on Twitter, and they're not actually real people, right? But they drive human behavior because they give the impression that, well, everybody thinks this. It's just natural to think this. And finally, China's social credit system, where between a broad system of closed camera TVs and deeply integrated data systems around sort of smart homes and smart currency, people who do things that are not considered socially acceptable, like they buy too much liquor at the liquor store, or they don't go to work on time, are having their travel tickets rescinded, potentially can't get passports. If they are critical on social media of certain government, it is a totalizing system. So it's a polluted environment out there that I work in right now. This is the end of the very scary part. And that's enough internet. I'll rescue you, I'll grab you like a little kitten and take you out the door. But ultimately, basically, the TLDR, the too long didn't read, of that where we've gotten in literally my short 13 years kind of working on the web is we've handed over control of our data, our identities, and our shared public infrastructures, including democracy. And we're outsourcing, and this is the piece that's interesting for higher ed. Higher ed's role in society. And I'm not a believer that as an educator or a teacher, I actually need to be the one talking all the time, or I need to be the knower, right? We live in a time of knowledge abundance. I really truly believe in participatory education, where people bring what they've got to the table. But higher ed has been the engine in our society where the ideas of what counts as knowledge get made. And increasingly, we are outsourcing our concepts of knowledge to data systems that are designed by folks who, for the most part, are not coming out of liberal arts backgrounds. I was actually talking with someone on Twitter about this just this morning, but out of short-term, just-in-time MOOC-style projects. And the word MOOC was coined in my house. My partner coined the term MOOC. We were part of the early, more participatory work in that space. So I'm not anti-MOOC, but I am concerned that the folks who are now deciding what counts as knowledge and building it into the tech and AI systems that we are using, higher ed is largely irrelevant and is not shaping them, is not serving their needs, and our capacity to have a seat at the table societally is somewhat limited unless we understand what's going on. So, thanks very much. Nice of you to come out. No, I don't think that we should run away. Academic social media, we need to rethink our strategy of hoping the internet will just go away. How many of you have been in that meeting? I've been in that meeting regularly. We have a gap. It has only emerged in a short period of time. We have a window in which those of us who care about the public mission of higher ed can still be involved in trying to bring ourselves and our institutions back into that conversation. I think we need to actually bring back the idea of the web, the participatory, pro-social web. And to some extent, I still think that the ideas of the Antigonish movement are helpful and foundational as a guide for how to go about that. The Luddites. Now, when I first thought about, okay, the web is a hot mess, what do? I thought, oh, well, maybe we could just become Luddites, right? How many of you ever said, oh, I'm a Luddite? Fair. The truth is the Luddites weren't actually anti-technology. And again, I'm not a history professor, so this is your sort of Wikipedia skinny version, but they were mostly artisans and skilled workers who, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, were very much encroached on by changing industrialization, right? And basically, they saw their role in society and what they had to contribute disappearing. And they decided to kind of take collective action because they had no vote. They were not enfranchised in the system they were in. They mostly were not landowners, right? And votes were a little skinnier then. So they organized these friendly societies based on the guild model, but for their own protection. And they got together and they did break the machines. And 14 of them were executed. So it's not a light thing that they undertook. But basically, they have come down to us. What I tend to hear the word Luddite as someone who, oh, I don't use technology, or oh, I eschew technology. And that wasn't actually, it wasn't the technology that was the point for the Luddites. It was the system that they were trying to fight. The technology was just the easiest thing for them to attack. Now, I think we have a problem, but if I take my phone and I toss it out the door, or I step on it here and make great theater, other than possibly making a good YouTube video, it is not actually going to change anything, because even if I do decide I am going to go about my teaching entirely non-digitally because the system's a mess, the problem is this system has leaked past just classrooms. It has leaked past just my job. It has leaked into, again, our democracy. And the people who live down the street from me and vote are still getting their information from Facebook. So, sadly, we do not get to be Luddites. We are actually, in this society, highly enfranchised people. And I'd like to encourage us to use some of the systems that we have available to us to try to find ways to push back at these systems. Because we need hope, but I think our hope needs to be a subversive hope. I don't think that the direction, in terms of data, that things are going, is something that we can just be like, oh, it'll be fine. And I don't think it's something that we can be like, oh, there's nothing we can do. I think we need to understand it and figure out ways to kind of grow in the cracks, in the sidewalks within it. And to do that, we need to understand those systems that we are a part of. I keep coming back to the systems, because what I'd like to propose as an idea is the idea of a critical digital pedagogy. And again, working on Miles Horton's work, nothing will change until we change, until we throw off our dependence and act for ourselves. And the stakes are very high, because the Highlander Center, which again has been in Tennessee since the 20s, was burned last week. And they found out 4 days later, they found a white power symbol at the site. So these are actually the times that we are in. In a space like this one, that carries a shared history with that space, we need to be aware that we are living and working in a historical space that may be targeted. We might as well figure out, how do we get at the systems that have created this kind of push and this kind of threat. So, I see 3 potential thinking tools, or keys, that I'd like to propose as ways for us to work in the cracks, in the sidewalk of the systems that we're in, and try to build a better web together. In whatever small ways, in whatever ways that you use the web, let's try to use it to actually push back against that system. And they are complexity, cooperation, and contribution. Now, the idea of complexity is key in the sense that the data systems that we're talking about don't necessarily, they're not visible to us, they're not transparent, but they are also not necessarily complex. This is the Keynesian Model for problem solving. Have any of you ever seen it before? Comes out of Wales. Guy named Dave Snowden and Mary Boone published this. It actually is from like the Harvard Business Review, so it's a leadership framework. But it is for deciding which domain your problem is in. And there are 4 key domains, and then there's disorder in the middle. And the 4 key domains are the obvious domain, the complicated domain, the complex domain, and the chaotic domain. And the idea is, okay, you have a problem. To know how to deal with it, you've got to figure out what kind of problem you have. Fair? So, the obvious domain is the domain of basically simple problems. Right? What's my problem here? I have 2 small, adorable, furry animals, and how many carrots? I have 1 caret, right? How can I solve my problem? Bingo. Even the animals themselves, although they probably can't, their little paws can't do it, have figured out that there are 2, there is 1, we need to share. In an obvious domain problem, you basically can tell, everybody involved can more or less see what the problem is, and can more or less usually come to fairly visible and agreeable solutions about it. The cause and effect tends to be obvious or clear, and you don't require expertise to figure that out, right? Are those hamsters? I'm not. Thank you. I am not a zoologist, yes. But those guinea pigs probably are not experts, but they can figure out what their problem is, right? In an obvious problem, there's really only kind of one answer that's needed. That answer will work, doesn't require expertise, and you can Google it if you need to. So, a simple machine, the light switch. Right? Behind it, something complicated, but for me, the user, simple machine. This is more of a complicated problem. In the complicated domain, this jet airliner is many, many, many pieces put together. Right? Now, I'm going to fly on one of these tonight to Ireland, and I want all of those pieces to be in the right place. With a complicated problem, more than one solution is possible, but a solution is possible. Requires subject matter expertise, is usually a lot of work, right? I am not the person who should be fixing the airplane. That's not my expertise. Another parallel for obvious versus complicated problems, 2 + 2, what's the answer? 4. That's an obvious problem. A long string algebra problem, complicated, requires more expertise. Then we get into complex. And in the complex domain, you don't have a solution. You can only work on part of the problem. You need to iterate. Iterate means try, figure out which part didn't work, try again, right? And you have to look for patterns. You have emergent solutions to a complex problem. You cannot go, oh, I did it this way last time, so this will definitely work this time. Those are obvious, complicated, complex. You with me so far? Chaos, we're not going to worry about too much, because chaos, or the chaotic domain, if your problem is there, it's kind of like, hey, your house is on fire. You need to act now. You just need to get up and go. And so the piece that I'm interested in terms of thinking about data and the web, is the distinction between complicated and complex. Okay? So I want to just do a little testing here. Landing on the moon. What do you think? Is it a complicated problem or a complex problem?
Complicated.
It's complicated, because you know when you got to the moon, right? And in many steps and expertise. Did anybody see Hidden Figures? Okay, it's great. Climate change. Complex. I'm not sure we'll know when we've solved it if we solve it. And it's emergent. We have to look at patterns. Pieces of it may be complicated, and experts are valuable, but overall, the scope of the problem is complex. Yeah, I think the kids part is probably chaotic, but at least complex, right? Because it's human problems. And I can't determine whether when that kid gets out of bed on a Thursday or a Friday, just because something worked on Thursday does not mean it's going to work on Friday. I can read all the expert parenting books in the world, but that person, both of those people are individual humans. Coding. Complicated. Right? Now, coding is always sold as the solution to education. Oh, we need to teach the kids coding. The interesting thing, and a lot of this is around, well, there's going to be automation and no jobs in the future. The complicated jobs are actually the ones far more likely to be taken by automation than jobs that deal with complexity. Personalized learning through predictive analytics. Yay, student success. Predictive analytics, and this kind of version of personalized learning. How many of you remember the Choose Your Own Adventure novels from the 80s? Right. I'm going to go into the cave. Oh, crap, there's a dragon. And then you have to go back a few steps. That idea, Khan Academy premiered that really back in like 2009 or 10 on the web. And what they were doing was saying, okay, I'm going to teach you geometry, okay? And we've noticed that 73% of the students who are trying to learn this particular problem, when they get to step C, they've made the same mistake as you, but when we gave them this intervention, when we gave them intervention X, then they did better next time. So that's how that version of personalized learning operates. Complicated or complex? I would say it's complicated because it is still a complicated series of steps, right? It is a determination of, oh, you went into the cave, the dragon ate you, go back, now you're going to try the other piece. This is why the dragon ate you, moving on. And so what you're doing is, it's kind of like a video game. You're going through a series of steps, but the end pieces are actually always the same, okay? But the student success piece behind the claim that they're making for personalized learning is actually, it's complex, right? What brings this young woman to graduation is not just the personalized learning of particular geometry concepts, but everything that intersects for her in terms of family, class opportunities, race, gender, the experiences she as an individual has at the particular school she goes to, belonging, all of those pieces. And so sometimes things that are complicated get sold to us as answers for things that are complex. And this is happening increasingly as datafication of education becomes more common, right? We see it, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this with the fancy technology that most of us don't have the expertise to understand, me included, but it's being sold to answer complex problems. Complicated systems of thought can't actually solve complex problems. Machine intelligence, computational thinking, it's great, but it's rapidly outstripping human performance in some areas. There are other things that it is literally just not designed to touch, right? And that the people who are training and trained to build these systems may not have any idea of. It's not baked into these complicated data systems, right? So this is George Siemens, who I was talking about some of this with. And he said, "Dear Twitter, today I want you to know that the term learning engineering is the stupidest word foisted upon the edtech space over the last 3 decades, which is a major, major claim." Juliana here, who is based in Spain, came back and said, yeah, let's use semiotics on this. Engineering means white, technocratic, industrial, and post-industrial male power. Right? Basically, engineering is a code word for a certain type of thought in our society. And it's a code word that has a lot of power right now. Right? So she said, let's take the meaning embedded in the term to the excluded peripheral education, not a social process anymore. Whenever we see these semiotic moves to take something like teaching and call it learning engineering, right? Or even instructional design and call it learning engineering, we need to be aware that what's happening is a conscious, intentional power move on the part of the complicated, on the part of the data and the AI. And those are things, they happen in our systems. We can talk about these things at the tables we are at. We can push back on these things and go, wait a second, whoa, hold on. What are the implications of this, right? Cambridge Analytica, you've all heard about Cambridge Analytica, I'm assuming, and Facebook and the 2016 election, etc. Hijacked democracy, complicated or complex? The process behind Cambridge Analytica and how it works is a complicated process. The problem that it creates is a complex problem. And this is just me from last week when I logged into LinkedIn, and it likes to tell me about jobs I might like. And you know, we are handing an awful lot of power in our society over to these predictive analytics, but if you have ever tried to look for a job on LinkedIn, it's garbage, right? It thought I might like to be a transit system manager in Winnipeg. I can assure you I can barely drive. And transit systems are not my area of expertise, nor are they any job I've ever looked at, nor Winnipeg is lovely, but do I want to live there at this point in my life? So I have concerns. If we are going to push back, we need pedagogies and practices that foreground complexity. And we need to be able to make that distinction and recognize the complicated when it's being sold to us. Complex problems, and most of our educational problems are complex problems. They have no single right answer. They represent a system in constant flux, and they are patterning problems, right? And how we deal with them is we probe, that should say sense, sorry, that's my mistake, and respond. Probe, sense, and respond. And that is the Keynesian complex approach to problems. And I just want to put that in front of you because I think it's really valuable. And the fact that Keynesian comes in a nice Harvard Business Review article means that sometimes senior leadership are willing to read about it. I also think cooperation is important. How can we design our socio-technical systems differently, right? I don't think this is a real proverb, but I read it in lots of inspirational places, so I thought I would share it anyway, with the caveat that I imagine somebody made it up so it would go far on Instagram. But if you want to travel fast, travel alone. If you want to travel far, travel together. And I'd like to call for us to travel together and look at the web as a complex system of collaboration and cooperation, very much like scholarship. Right? If you go back to the roots of scholarship with the Royal Society in the 1700s, it was people going, oh, look, I figured this out, I got to send it to you. And our systems have become much faster, but they're really still that big webbed system. Collaboration is coordinated synchronous activity that maintains the shared idea of a problem. Okay, so I would love for us to collaborate, all of us in this room, to try in our own small ways and practices to push back against this complification, this datafication. But I'd also like us to consider cooperating, dividing labor among participants so each unit is responsible for solving a portion of the problem. And I think part of the problem is we've made ourselves extras in our systems. Right? So that the systems that govern a lot of how society and education work aren't systems we have a core place in. Which means that we can't fix the web without the machines. And a lot of my work goes back to, have any of you ever heard of Donna Haraway? Okay, so I love, like, totally fangirl Donna Haraway's early work on cyborgs, and I still think that the cyborg is probably the most productive model that we have at this point. And I don't mean the new and shiny cyborg of movies. I mean the 1985 cyborg of trying to figure out how we are hybrid, partial, subversive, and part of the society that we live in. Hybrids, cyborgs are hybrids, but Haraway says they're about transgressed boundaries, potent fusions, and dangerous possibilities. And she says the cyborg is outside salvation history. The cyborg is not a savior, right? So the idea of being a cyborg who cooperates with the machines, who figures out a way to work with the machines to undermine the system that created them, is not there to save everything. is not leaping in like the cyborgs in the movies, but is working to dismantle, to push apart the pavement like the little thing that grows. And the way to do that is still through the networks that scholarship is built on. Okay, this is just a model of a network. Now, when I talk about networks, this is tidier than most networks really are, but basically, how many of you have a family? Yeah. Most of us do. The family is really the original sort of networked form of human interaction. And if you imagine, right, I can't stand on that side. If you imagine one of those little clusters, maybe as your family, you are one of the dots, and the other dots would be other people in that family. And the lines connecting the dots are the relationships, the historical buildup of multiple interactions and feelings between those people, right? So how many of you have or grew up with a sibling? Okay. How many of you have the identical relationship or had with your mother that sibling did? No. And I always say, I'm sure your mother loved you best. It's okay. But each relationship is individual. In a time of knowledge abundance, our way of making sense of the world is still networked in this same way. And so the information that if you're here and one of those nodes that you're connected to is the New York Times and one of them is the National Enquirer, maybe you have a different perception about the information, maybe you don't, that comes at you from those particular nodes, right? It's the same as if your brother says, oh, hey, you look great. You might be like, is there toilet paper hanging off my back? Whereas if your mother says, hey, you look great, you might be more like, oh, Mom, you always say that, right? We take information from different nodes in networks differently. If we use the networks that we have to build our presence on the web, even on those polluted platforms. Haraway talks about the polluted inheritance of the Enlightenment. I would like to talk about the polluted inheritance of digital platforms as necessary spaces for us to continue to find productive ways to inhabit and participate in, so that the people in our networks can find out and connect to the things that we know to resist this, and we can learn from them. And webs are fragile. Spider webs are easy to break, but pound for pound, they are also one of the strongest things, stronger than steel, at the metaphorical and physical level. One last little piece of Canadian scholarly history. When I was 10, my father lived in the Arctic. I grew up in PEI, but my father lived my whole life far, far away in the Arctic. And one time when I was 10, I went to visit. So we were in the town of Cambridge Bay, which is kind of there above the word warning. And it is north of the tree line, north of the Arctic Circle, tundra, entirely different cultural and physical landscape for me as a little kid. I didn't spend very much time with my father, so really I was kind of like at this weird foreign summer camp. And we went out camping on the land. And what you could see outside the town of Cambridge Bay was this giant research industrial center that looked like nothing I had ever seen in PEI, and it was the dew line. And I said, oh, what's a dew line? And he said, oh, it's the distant early warning system in case the Russians, drop bombs on us or anything like that. I'm sure he said it probably more kindly than that, but 10-year-old me was like, oh my God. And the dew line existed all across the north of Canada until the 90s, along that line there. In 1969, Marshall McLuhan took the idea of the dew line and tried for a while to create sort of a media communications scholarly concept of it, where we would connect with each other and be that distant early warning signal about things that were happening. And one of the key, he did a whole deck of cards on this do line, and one of the key ideas from it was, to the blind, all things are sudden, which he took from a guy named Alex Layton. I think it's important that we not let the implications and impacts of datafication creep up on us suddenly and then be like, oh my stars. We need to be each other's do line. So, the last little piece is just very quickly ways that we can contribute to the web in order to be each other's do line. And this is from a talk given at OLC Innovate in the States last week by Tressie McMillan Cotton, who you should be reading, and it's just change never trickles down. Change trickles up. So, I'm aware of time, and I'm thinking what I'm going to get you to do is just very quickly grab a piece of paper on your table and make a triangle. Yeah, just make a triangle, big enough that you can write a couple of things inside and outside of it. Doesn't have to be a pretty triangle. Yeah. Oh, okay, I understand. You made an well, that's cool too, although it's harder to write on. So if you just make a triangle that looks something like this, what I'd like you to think about are what are 3 spaces on the web, potentially, and if you don't have 3, that's okay, that you connect with other people and leave traces, could be scholarly traces, could be totally personal traces, where they can learn what you think, where they can learn from you, okay, where you can connect to people and maybe learn from them too. And figure out, are they spaces, is your information locked away there? So for instance, if it's a formal journal that is closed, that people have to have a subscription to the right library, etc., to see it, it would go inside the triangle, and that's fine because people do still read those pieces. And if it is something where it is more open for people to see, put it outside the triangle. Okay, so 3 places where you leave traces on the web. And I want you to decide if they are closed or open.
By traces, do you mean that you've actually authored something, or that people can just see that?
It could be a status update. Like, it doesn't have to be scholarly work, right?
No, but if by trace, do you also mean that if I, for example, if I'm at academia.eu, then it starts sending me articles that it might think I might want to read.
That wouldn't be your trace, though.
That's not my trace.
No, that's not your trace. That's other people's traces that are being sent to you. So just some trace that you were there. Something inside the triangle. That's good. Sometimes the inside the triangle spaces are significantly less polluted, so it's a trade-off right now, right? How many of you have something outside the triangle? Okay, that can also be good because it is easier for people to find you and connect with you and actually build some kind of thinking, collaborating relationship together. You need to contribute and leave traces somewhere on the web for people to be able to do that collaboration and cooperation with you, basically. This afternoon, I challenge you to think about maybe building conversations that as you're talking, think about where would the traces of this be left? And maybe think about designing both closed spaces where you're sure that the information goes out the way you want it, and also open spaces where more people are likely to hook into it. Okay? It's hard to leave traces on the web. This is from a talk I did last week at Virginia Tech, and they asked us to design our own badges at the beginning. And I was amazed at how hard it was to think through which stickers I wanted and what I wanted to represent me. And it's just a name tag for like a morning. But it's hard to put our identities out there and think about, okay, I'm going to leave a trace. But the truth is, it's important that we do. We can't form that sort of chain of information and visible ideas for other people unless we leave something. So it doesn't have to be perfect. These are just some ways, okay, to do it. Now, it's true. This is this pro-social web idea is one that my partner and I are both talking about a lot these days. And he wrote a post last week about it because we're going to be talking in Ireland later this week about this idea of building a pro-social web. And Stephen Downes, who's been a big figure in Canadian higher ed, and particularly MOOCs, came on and posted as a comment, and he said, yeah, but no amount of human posting will be sufficient to counter the bot-driven or mechanical Turk-driven content on the internet, right? And he's totally right. I don't think that we're all going to get out there and contribute enough that we drive out the bots. That's not what I'm talking about. But Stephen uses the web, and I have great respect for Stephen, but he uses the web to broadcast. Right? Because he was a super early adopter, and so he doesn't follow anyone on Twitter, but thousands and thousands of people follow him. So his concern is getting the message out. I'm much more concerned about the relationship building. Not the message, but the, hey, I know who you are now, and I know your face, and when I see something show up from you, I recognize that you're in my network, and maybe I take a second to read it. That's the piece that I'm interested in here. Okay? Not the piece around broadcast. So, remember, if we're going to a pro-social web, that digital citizenship, digital pedagogy is all about people. It's about building those relationships. It's about building the web as a place that you could stand to be. And it's still a participatory structure underneath all of the enclosure, so we can still push things out and use our networks to get them seen. I use it for work. This is just, I keep a profile, essentially, a portfolio page for myself. But it also suggests we could use it for play. We could all dress up in cosplay and Harry Potter so we can't be seen by the surveillance. I think they're kidding, but maybe. For art, this is work by Sava Sahili Singh out of Queens and Kingston. She's making movies about surveillance and its impacts in society and trying to get those out there. And it is the surveillance project, Screening Surveillance at Queens. For scholarship, how many of you have a Google Scholar account so people can find your stuff easily? Now, Google has all kinds of problems. I'm not going to say you should be there. But if you are there, keep it updated. Keep your stuff out. Get it out there. Right? For sharing sources, for resources and recommendations. Are there any grad students here? So PhD chat is a really great sort of way to connect with other people in your situation in different places. I desperately needed that when I was doing my PhD because there were 4 people in my PhD program, 3 by Christmas. One of them was studying music education and one of them was studying being a principal. So we didn't intersect at all, lovely humans, but I needed a cohort elsewhere. You may be the same in whatever it is that you're doing. Find the hashtags, find the people out there doing the stuff that you care about and connect with them. Sharing support with each other, right? Just getting people through the tough things. Publishing, especially openly. Any librarians in the room? Love you guys. Because you're helping me understand open publishing better. And the web was initially meant to share scholarly resources. That was one of its core, outside of the military-industrial piece, one of its core purposes. And then Elsevier basically bought that all up. Research funding. Consider, if you're applying for funding, if you take money from Facebook or Google, what are the implications of that for where the work goes? For personal and professional learning, just build a PLN. This guy, Harold Jarkey, he's in Sackville, New Brunswick. He does really interesting work on the future of work, and he kind of leads an open Twitter-based community of folks and runs some courses about some of these concepts and change and how it's happening. Connect with people that you can learn from. Do the stuff you're doing today. These are the other THAT camps that are happening coming up, right? There's St. Louis and New York and Memphis and a race, gender, and technology one in Nashville, Utrecht. They're going to have hashtags. People are going to be sharing stuff from those. Consider checking in on them. Consider joining some of those conversations. That is how we use the web to connect, right? And finally, for teaching. Bell Hooks, 1994, back to the critical pedagogy piece. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. We have the opportunity to labor for freedom, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries and to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom, and I think that we need it perhaps more than ever. So in terms of Antigonish 2 and the idea that Wendy and I tried to grow, the idea of Antigonish 2 lives here now. I don't live in the Maritimes anymore. Darn it. But there is a network, and I'm happy to share things if they're happening with that network. I'm beginning research into educators' data literacies, and I'd love to bring the Antigonish network into that, because I feel like rather than just try to share resources about media literacies when other people can do it better, I'd like to dig in, and now I can do some deep research into stuff. And we're also just starting at OER this week to share a hashtag called the pro-social web, right? What can we do to build the pro-social web? So feel free to contribute ideas to that. This is from the Forward Stories a few years ago. We can start now, we could start anytime, we can restart every day. We can do better together, and if we are compliant to the technocratic systems that have already encroached on our space, then yeah, we could hand it all over, but I don't think we need to. But we need to be disobedient to those complicated systems and do the work of education that most of us went into higher ed for. So, thank you. Cheerful talk.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful talk. We will take a couple of minutes for questions now, but I would ask folks to use a microphone for accessibility reasons and because we will have a version of this talk up on YouTube later, which we will send you the link for. Do we have questions or comments for our wonderful speaker today?
I was just wondering what you think about having different age groups using, because as you were talking, I was thinking about how my dad reads his news on MSN.com and forwards me all of the articles and thinks that, they're all, it's sort of pooled like a random news feed, pulled from just everywhere, but because it's all brought together in one space, it gives you the illusion that it's like kind of catered to, or that it reflects what the news world really is. Right. So I don't know if you know, if you want to talk about the difference between like teaching undergrads with technology or, thinking about our parents' generations. And
are you asking in a sense about sort of the idea of the filter bubble? That everybody, like different generations, are getting our sense of reality from different places? Or just how do we deal with that?
I've never heard the expression filter bubble, so maybe you can talk a bit about that.
I think I can't remember the person's name. It's like
Eli Pariser?
Pariser, thank you. Pariser's work is that we tend to create these filter bubbles with our own curated social media. So that, how many of you get most of your news online now? Right, and you've chosen how you get it. How? Did anybody make like a conscious decision to try to bring in a whole bunch of different sources, or?
But Apple News now.
Yep.
Well, Twitter is good for that, actually.
Twitter can be good for that, depending on who you follow. Yep. Yeah, if you follow them, right? So if you cultivate a network that brings you information from different sources, then that can be really good. I've actually, because I was living in the Maritimes and I didn't know, a lot of, for instance, people of color in the US, Twitter was actually a huge kind of eye-opener for me in terms of a lot of lived experience conversations that I'd never had the opportunity to be in, right? But through colleagues that I developed relationships with who shared about their lives and their experiences, it was like a truly kind of eye-opening realization for me. At the same time, I do get most of my news from Twitter, and it's not necessarily a perfect source because I am definitely getting a particularly curated perspective. And if I took a little more time to, say, read a local paper, I would hear and see some different things that might, A, let me know more about what's happening where I live, except that I was trying to follow the PEI news and then they put it under a paywall. So I won't be doing that anymore, I guess. But like the Windsor, Ontario news, great. But also so that I get a sense of where the people in my classrooms or my parent or whatever, what their version of reality might be. Because I think speaking across versions of reality is increasingly a challenge that we have. I don't think that the fact that your dad gets his news where he does is a problem, but if you teach multi-age classes, you got to assume that there's diversity in your class even if you can't see it. So even if everybody looks the same, they may actually be reading things from totally different versions of reality. And that's a real challenge these days, right?
Hi, Bonnie. Just to follow on the topic of the news, and it's part and parcel of the problem that you're addressing today is the collapse of local news sources, and your reference to local, preferring to get some news at least from local sources. Increasingly, there aren't local sources, and I think that part of the complexity of the problem that follows from that is that one tests reality locally.
Yep.
And so if a local newspaper reports right now that it's snowing, we can look out the window and see that it's wrong.
Yep.
Whereas when we get a national feed saying it's snowing today in the Maritimes,
Yep.
Who's wrong? Me or the news, right?
That's a really great point. And I think with the local news stuff, what's happened is local vetted news, right? And again, the great promise of Web 2.0 was let's get past gatekeeping. And there are lots of ways in which it's wonderful that people can have their own voice and contribute to the collective polity. But at the same time, what happens is replacing local news that's gatekept can be local underground organizations, private Facebook groups of people with very polarized and sometimes very political agendas that may sway kind of the people in their feed, or may be intentionally being used to kind of push people to the sense that, no, this is normal. Have any of you ever heard the concept of the Overton window? So it comes out of the Reagan 80s. Overton was some politico who worked for Reagan. And in the early days of sort of the American conservative move to the right, there was an intentional shift of let us take what is not currently speakable and push it out here. So the Overton window is that concept of what is speakable in a given time. And what is speakable has changed drastically just in the last 5 years, right? If you look at, for instance, even the policies of the Reagan-era Republicans versus the policies of the current American government, they're drastically different, particularly on subjects like immigration and those things, but that is partly that moving of what is speakable and thinkable and can be said in public. And so without a lot of local news, a lot of us get our sense of what our neighbors think from things that come out on Facebook, and what you're often seeing are the most extreme versions of that, right? Because the middle tend not to speak so much. So yeah, problem.
Hi. Just like seeing how more, it's very recent and emerging, this whole polarity of the internet. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, who was kind of the poster boy of net neutrality last fall, just on, I think it was March 30th, came out and said we really need a global regulation on the internet. It's that quick of a flip, which, I mean, I think it was Abraham Lincoln once said, you can't believe everything you heard on the internet. And,
it's one of my favorite of his quotes.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, and so it's a kind of a hard thing, not only for the pedagogy of, for people to be able to teach online, but also grades, marking online. There's going to be so many students with a wave of information that's coming in that you're going to be, like, teachers and faculty are going to be marking that is like Abe Lincoln quotes or whatever, and that you have to sift through, and like you just can't sift through it all. Yeah. It's anyway, it was more of a point, not a question.
Yeah, that's all right. It's true, right? We live in really interesting times. What we do about that, I think we need to make individual decisions and try to bring them into our systems if that trajectory is not one that we're personally a fan of.
Hey, Bonnie. So a little provocation to your provocation.
Awesome.
So all this pro-social web stuff is great. Are you assuming that everyone has equal access to the web? Like, how might your ideas migrate or apply or adapt beyond the experiences of the privileged users in this room and the kind of worlds that we occupy online? And you asked us to draw that triangle, and sometimes I wonder if the web that we think about is inside the triangle. I think
the web that all of us think about is inside a triangle, for sure. I mean, I am making assumptions that since most of us have the university affiliation to be here today, probably have some digital access, probably have the language and concepts to understand certain shared pieces of this. It is absolutely not the case even within this country, let alone once you go to different geopolitical situations. So there are places where currently, even in the US, while your data is being collected, and I'm not sure what the long-term implications of that will be, most of my US colleagues still feel reasonably safe to try to make this kind of active move and connect around this stuff. I know that there are repressive governments where it would not be safe or responsible for me to give this kind of talk. I do think that as we are moving into participating on the web, we do need to be thinking about, look, is this going to come back to haunt me at some point? And be, considerate of perhaps the potential implications of speech, of the traces that we leave. I also think that certainly there are people for whom there are much more pressing concerns than what kind of traces they're leaving on the web or what happens to higher ed. So I don't think as a whole society, this is a call for everyone, but for me it is very much a call for those of us invested in higher ed, in the Anglosphere, under semi-democratic institutions and governments, because I think these are the ways that we protect those semi-democratic institutions and concepts of governance. But I don't think it's a universal, hey everybody, this is the most important thing we got going on. Is that fair?
This has been really fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, I guess right now I have so many more questions. I feel like you could give a whole day about the things that I'm interested in. Like, I keep wondering about the digital divide between the global north and the south, and how people are excluded or included in these spaces, and also the role of gender and decolonization and also how to prevent this polarization that occurs. Especially my area is climate change, and I purposely engage or read a lot of people who don't believe in climate change science and all of this, just to try to, because in my opinion, you can't really make a change unless you understand all of the different positions. And it's just a really frustrating space because it's not about the issue, it's also about psychology, about people's fears, and it's that deep human understanding that of people's fears and insecurities that make them more polarized, that make people have extreme positions that kind of get lost on the web, I find. So anyway, thank you. I'm going to be thinking about this for a few days.
Okay, thanks. I think the web has given people's fears a space to be heard that may, even when they're not necessarily legitimate. It's one thing to have fears, and then another thing to present those fears as truth. And when you get an audience for those fears that you've presented as truth, then you build a whole army of followers, and potentially we are dealing with, in some ways, extreme democratization that is actually threatening to the institutions of democracy. And that's kind of weird, but it's truly where we're at. And I don't think there are easy answers to any of it. One of the things that Haraway talked about, even in '85, and I'll stop here, was her work was always kind of, she said, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And in the 80s, the politics of kind of anti-nuclear and the against the military-industrial complex tended to move towards a binary polarization of, well, here's the natural and the good and the pure, and then here's all this polluted crap. And what the cyborg is actually about rejecting the idea of purity, because you're never going to get there. Let us work in cooperation with these messy, problematic systems that we've got and figure out, not searching for purity within them, but searching for the actual cooperation that will allow us to change them. How do we make this better as it is, without wishing it were over here in a Garden of Eden? So, anyway, thank you very much for your time. We can talk over lunch. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we'll have one more question,
Great,
and then we'll
okay.
break for our lunch.
I didn't want to everybody to eat me instead.
Hi, sorry, Bonnie. I'll be very quick, but I just wanted to thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and one thing that I am thinking a lot about concerns the story that you shared about your and Wendy's work on the Antigonish 2, and how there were many different structural conditions and contingencies that made that McLuhan's the medium is the message so clear to you. So I guess my question is, how, recognizing the precarity of the work that we're doing within the institution, how do we do that type of cooperation and leverage, with people that may have different roles within the system or outside of the system, so that it's not that pattern, so that it doesn't become just a complicated situation where you work towards the pro-social web or something, and then you can't, and then it becomes someone else's task to take it up.
Great question. I think part of the sort of change management cycle, I guess, if you really want to do change, and if any of you are thinking about change projects that you want to start or want to take up anything related to these pieces, you can do a lot for free on the internet, and that's part of the great end of the democratization piece, right? We were able to generate a lot of attention and interest and sign-ups and all of those things, and I think that we probably, had I remained in the Maritimes, could have been able to actually structure a face-to-face gathering to begin to figure out next steps, and that might be something that you're still interested in doing. But institutions tend to be most able to value what they can see and what has sort of money and visible structures attached to it. So doing a conference is visible to an institution and can be supported to grant bodies, right, that type of thing. If you can get senior leadership engaged in the conversation and they happen to have money to create a position to do something, great. But networked ephemeral stuff is very hard for institutions to value, partly because in our time and culture, innovation has been recoded in a complicated sense as something you can package and sell, right? And so that is the actual driving sort of reality of how things tend to get traction, is you almost need to be able to package something up that people can point to, get deep enough in to understand it, and then maybe get on board. You know, even like, and I don't think that's new, because Marshall McLuhan had a whole engine of institutional supports around him in the 60s. It's not something that's a new challenge, but you've got to create something that senior leadership can point to and get behind and potentially fund or not, right? I mean, you may be able to get external funding, but people have to get the sense that there is something going on. Have any of you ever supported a crowdfunding initiative? Mm-hmm. You know, you see the ones go through and they've got like $12 and there's only 2 days left, and you're like, oh, that's sad, but I can't get behind that. Mm-hmm. That's human nature, right? That's nudge behavior. But if you get momentum going, then, and you can also make it visible to your institution, then you are much more likely to achieve change.
So I think part of the solution to that is to agitate in our faculty agreements for the recognition of all activities.
Yes.
Seriously, we can do that part of it as academics.
Yeah, that's huge.
Absolutely. Well, let's thank Professor Stewart for her fantastic contribution today. I know our discussions this afternoon will certainly build on and continue these threads. Thank you so much.
Thanks.